Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the afternoon session on tax dispute resolution. Uh, Before I start, I just wanted to convey a word of thanks and gratitude to ICRIER and to Mr. R.R. Singh in particular for inviting me to contribute to this chapter, which is an integral part of the book on challenges of tax administration. Uh, when I discussed this with some of my friends in the government, they said, couldn't it have been more positively worded by saying challenges and opportunities? So, that said, I think what we have in this session is a discussion. I just have few slides. I didn't know what the format of this session would be, so I just put out some slides. I'm just going to skim through all the slides. The slides are available with ICRIER, but the whole idea is to get some debate going with our panelists on this important topic of tax dispute resolution. And in a way, I'm glad that Mr. Arvind Modi is here, so that at least we have a voice to listen and he can carry the messages back to make our dispute resolution system more effective. Sitting on my extreme left is Ms. Rekha Shukla. She is a IRS of 1989 batch. Ma'am, I'm not going to read out the entire long resume, but she is actually representing the tax administration. To Ms. Shukla's right is Bela Seth Mao. Bela is someone who straddles both. She started a career as a IRS official, and then she moved on to professional services and then corporate world. She's currently the head of tax for Shell as one of the largest integrated energy companies, and she leads the tax function. To Bela's right is my friend Sachit Jolly. He is an advocate and he's a counsel working with a leading law firm, DMD Legal. Sachit again has a very interesting career as a litigator and very, very popularly known as Mr. Jolly's son, who was government's longest standing counsel in the Delhi High Court. At least that is how I got introduced to Sachit. So thank you very much for being with us. What I wanted to do was essentially take you through this, which is nothing but a summary of what we have put it out in our research findings. Really, what are the triggers? I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Sanjay Kumar, who I worked very closely when he was the Secretary for Tax Administrative Reforms Commission, and he and Dr. Shom co-opted me in the working group for tax disputes. So a lot of the things that I have picked up in the ICRIER research paper is partly deriving out of the TARC findings, some research which was not made use of, and some research which got edited in the course of the final report that was submitted to the government. So I have acknowledged all of those in the research paper that I've done for ICRIER. We actually, as a lawyer and as a practitioner, the temptation is to really look at how can you make the dispute resolution more effective, and the direct attention goes to the court system. How can we make the courts more effective? How can we make the tribunal more effective? But what we did in TARC, and which is what my approach was even in the ICRIER, was to let's look at what are the triggers, what causes disputes. So what is it that should be done from a tax policy stance to reduce the whole cause of dispute? Then we straight away did not jump on to how can you make the court system effective. We said that after a dispute has occurred, which is really a difference of view between the tax administration and the taxpayer, what are the viable options that are available either within the framework of law to be able to avoid that dispute going into the trial, or how is it that a settlement can occur? Now, I'm very mindful of the fact that our Indian law does not afford an opportunity for settlement of disputes. So that requires clearly legislative changes. But I think we've dealt with some forms of dispute avoidance and dispute resolution outside of the court or the trial process, as it is called in Western part of the world. And then finally, I have dealt with what is the emerging landscape. The reason we talk about the emerging landscape is because sooner than later, we need to change our thinking. So what kind of alternate dispute resolution system will occur? Why is it not possible for all forms of dispute to be settled by the court? Either the court machinery is not geared up, or the court doesn't have a specialist. Talking to some of the judges at the bar, they often ask this question, so how do we resolve a transfer pricing dispute? We do not have the whereabouts to be able to resolve a transfer pricing dispute because it is arising out of economic principles. So these disputes should in the first place never have come to the courts. So here are now our judiciary saying that disputes should ordinarily be resolved before it goes for trial. And then finally, my favorite topic, what are the alternate dispute resolution systems that are likely to evolve sooner than later in our country? Because in my view, that's the only way for us to keep pace with the system. I have some figures before I get on to the trends. These figures are rising alarmingly. 8 lakh crores. I wish government luck if they are able to collect this kind of money, because I personally feel that most of these will be get knocked down but by the courts. So I label this largely as mostly frivolous forms of litigation that have come about, and the question is, how do you deal with it? Because the sooner you deal with it, the better it is, because the underlying message with all of these figures suggests that we need to reflect at ourselves, how competitive we are as an investment destination. And I'm not just looking at it purely from a foreign direct investment standpoint, but largely from an investment standpoint, that with these kinds of figures, what kind of certainty are you signaling to businesses insofar as the tax system is concerned? And clearly you'll see from this chart, barring the CSTAT disputes from an excise and a customs standpoint, really from an income tax standpoint, the majority of the cases are pending before the Commissioner Appeals. I'm just reminded of Commissioner Appeals as an authority. I started my career in 1985, and I remember just 1 week after qualifying as a chartered accountant, I appeared before a commissioner. Some of you would be aware, a gentleman called Mr. Lalit Mohan. He used to be in Mumbai as Commissioner Appeals. And I had a matter in relation to ATO, and he could see me that I'm appearing before a Commissioner Appeals authority for the first time. And he asked me this question, and he said, okay, let me help you prepare a case. How do you actually go about? The decision didn't come for about several months, and then finally after several months I see a Commissioner Appeals order which was in our favor. Actually, he helped me prepare the appeal. I thought which was a relatively straightforward appeal, but really as a new chartered accountant, I went and I started shivering in front of him. Having said that, after many years after he retired, he mentioned to me that in those days, the matters that came up before Commissioner Appeals, a good 75 to 80% of appeals were decided in favor of the taxpayer. And really the department had to take a objective conscious call which are the cases which they should litigate before the tribunal. So if you look at the old income tax tribunal decision, you will seldom come across ITO versus the SSC or CIT versus the SSC. CIT is when the commissioner is filing an appeal. The reason I wanted to make this point is because for a variety of reasons, the authority of Commissioner Appeals, in my view, has got marginalized over the years, because the Commissioner Appeals really is not looking at matters in a judicious manner, and that's really what is getting reflected in these cases. Now, I have no doubt in my mind that all of these cases that you stand before Commissioner Appeals and the quantums that you see, most of it will go to the tribunal. And over the years, I have realized that the tribunals have started performing the functions which the low fact-finding authority should be looking at it. Now, this is something that the administration has to seriously reflect upon. My favorite topic, transfer pricing audits. I made this point in the earlier session when Mr. Mangotra was talking, how effective is our caste system and how effectively will it work. Had we put the caste system in place immediately after the transfer pricing law had come, would we have seen this kind of litigation? So that's really some of the other figures that I'm talking about. Let's look at the trends and the triggers. I think all of us are aware of it, and I would rather have a discussion with the panel. And really, I have put it out on 3 categories. What is the challenge that we have at the lawmaking level? What has been the approach of the administration? And what are the procedural challenges that we have, which results in high degree of disputes? On lawmaking, I think that the laws are no longer simpler. I think the whole idea of direct taxes code was being thought about was a brave idea, was an idea which said you'll have a brand new law in force and we will not have to deal with the age-old principles and we'll take away all the provisions in the law. So I think, we really have a challenge. And after the law is legislated, I think over the years, the whole empowerment for income tax rules, the whole empowerment of the board under Section 119, in my view, has reduced over the years. So I think we have to sit and debate that once a law is passed by the parliament, which really puts out the intent of the law, which really puts out the charging provisions, what is it that we should have by way of subordinate legislation, by way of rules, by way of CBDT circular, which help interpret that law. So if we are having, and to some extent we have followed now practices. So I do remember the long 135 question FAQ that was put out by you, sir, on the fringe benefits tax. So you need more and more of these to be able to interpret the law, because the law which is reduced to 4 pages, 6 pages or 8 pages is just not sufficient to be able to interpret. And so far as you have taxpayers and tax administration sitting on opposite side of the table, you will lead to varying interpretation, because we are more a principle based interpretation jurisdiction rather than rule based, which some of the countries have. So I think inadequate subordinate legislation clearly, in my view, has been a very significant contributor to litigation. Approach of the tax administration, I think it's been talked about earlier, so I will not labor much on that. But I'd like to mention differences in central and state level authorities. Now, on the indirect tax side, we've seen a whole lot of litigation that has come up because of sheer differences. So when you sell a prepaid card for a cell phone, is it a service that is being rendered, or is it a goods that's being survived? And that's just one example. There are examples on leasing transactions. There are examples on software licensing transactions, so on and so forth. Characterization issue. Is it that the state government has a power to levy a VAT, or is it that the federal government has a power to levy service tax on that? I have seen that as an increasing trend in the last several years. Rest of the aspects were talked about in the earlier session, so I won't talk about it. Procedural aspect, I think frequent transfers of tax officials, the failure of large taxpayer unit, we talked about in the earlier session as well, in my view, are procedural aspects that have led to this challenge. Let's look at the traditional forms of appeal. We all know that ITAT, Commissioner, I've just listed down what are the challenges that we have with each of those authorities. Let's look at the tribunal, Income Tax Appellate Tribunal, and personally feel that it's sheer case of overburdening of work that you have. So if you look at some of the tribunals, cases have not been decided for 11 years, 13 years, and just because they just don't have the bandwidth, they just don't have the strength to be able to deal with long cases. I must confess that in the major cities, particularly in Mumbai and Delhi, the situation is not as bad. But if you go to other cities, it's bad. Bangalore is bad. Ahmedabad is bad. So I think we need to look at how do you shift the burden and allocate resources to be able to deal with the ITAT. Shortage of specialized benches are set up. They are wrapped up. There is no continuity. Conflicting rulings. I wonder if there are issues that are likely to travel to the High Court because they are really contentious issues. Why is it that you cannot set up special benches? Setting up of special benches is a really big challenge. I pointed this out to the ITAT President, Justice Sood, when I visited last fortnight, and he was shocked to know that in order for tribunal to constitute a special bench, it has taken 2.5 years, and it has still not been constituted. He called for the files and said, I cannot believe that this application was moved in June 2014 to constitute a special bench. So, it should, constitution of special bench should be more a convention, because at the end of the day, here is a taxpayer facilitating for the dispute to resolve. I will not labor on other aspects, key challenges with other dispute resolution authorities, but we just in our research looked at some of the best practices that are there. Some of them were dealt with, whether it's a taxpayer approach, collaborative dispute resolution approach. I think until the time we have legislative changes which will permit settlement of cases, and I'm presuming that that is something that is not likely to occur in the near future. So when something goes for dispute, why does it go for dispute? If the subordinate legislation were detailed enough, then could we have avoided the dispute? If the guidelines that are published are detailed enough, could we have avoided that dispute? Why is it that many countries avoid dispute at the audit stage itself? The point, Dr. Sanjay Kumar, that you were making earlier in the context of US regulations. So I have an Indian company that has received a show cause notice for permanent establishment in the United States of America. The show cause notice is over 100 pages. And in the course of show cause notice, the IRS has clearly brought out, they first carried out a detailed investigation. Why do they feel that this company actually has a permanent establishment in India, in the United States, and that some income should be attributed in the US? They have brought out the entire findings of the IRS. And in my view, the IRS has built a watertight case, actually. If I looked at that show cause notice, I just feel it's very difficult for this Indian company to be able to escape the permanent establishment and the case that the IRS has brought out. So that's really the point that you were making, and I was just trying to relate to this example that I have in hand. So really the pick up few cases, devote a whole lot of energy and attention to those cases, and then be reasonably sure over a period of time it will becomes a practice that this is a taxpayer who's actually been evading taxes, and that the possibility of carrying out a major adjustment is very high. So that's really some of the aspects that we picked up from Canadian, US, UK, and Australian regulations. What are the learnings for India? I think there is no one size fits all kind of situations. The effort has to be made sustained effort has to be made over a period of time. We cannot fix this problem. It's not a 2 to 3 year problem. I think what we've identified is engaging stakeholders in the lawmaking process is very important. So just to give you an example, I take the point that we have deferred the GAR law, and we've deferred the GAR law for a variety of reasons. The question that we should be asking ourselves is, how much debate did we have in formulating the GAR law? So the UK debated the GAR law with the business chambers for 3 years. Confederation of British Industry, which is like equivalent to the CII, was consulted. And in the CBI debates at the UK level for the GAR law, views were sought even from foreign professionals and consultants. How would this GAR law be looked at it? So if an Indian company, large Indian companies are present in the United Kingdom, how would a Tata's or how would a Vedanta and how would these large companies view the GAR law? So that's the level of debate, and they put out the draft GAR law twice or thrice. So yes, we've been talking about the GAR law for the last 4 or 5 years. It didn't come as a surprise in 2012. But the question we should be asking ourselves is, have we engaged the stakeholders adequately? Encouraging enhanced relationship is something that got covered earlier. Issuing of interpretative statements is important. Empowering ombudsman. I think when the authority on ombudsman was set up, my view was that why doesn't it have a legislative backing? Why is an ombudsman an administrative authority? Let the ombudsman put out a report before the parliament that these were the grievances that were received from the taxpayer. This is how they were resolved. This is what they were not resolved. If they were not resolved, who was held accountable for it, so on and so forth. So until and unless we have a legislative backing for ombudsman, you're not going to have an effective authority. Delinking revenue collection from assessment, a point that has been made earlier. And finally, the whole point on training and development. So you really are looking at a host of initiatives over a period of time to be able to up the ante on effective dispute resolution. There are other forms of reforms that have either been undertaken or are likely to be undertaken. I just wanted to talk about the developing an e-filing requirement, and Sachit, you will bear me out that in the Delhi High Court, the e-filing has worked very, very effectively. So the judges actually don't look at the files. Now, why is it that we don't have e-filing? You walk into the tribunal today, there is no place to walk. You virtually falling on the files. Implement e-filing, you'll get rid of all the files. The corridors would look much more cleaner. Just one small initiative on the e-filing, so develop it at the tribunal level, automate the constitution, make the constitution of the special bench far more automatic, lay down a formal process for expert examination. It is nobody's business at the end of the day. Neither the taxpayer nor the tax administration understand the SSE's business. Who understands the business is the SSE himself. And the SSE has to now have the ability to be able to put independent expert witnesses. Let those expert witnesses get cross-examined by a court. Let him get cross-examined by the Commissioner Appeals or the tribunal. I remember this important case of Bharti which went into the Supreme Court on withholding tax issue, where the interconnect charges should be characterized as royalties or professional technical services. And interestingly, late Justice Kapadia said, I understand what interconnect charges it, but the technical nuances of what interconnect charges is not understood by anyone. How will the taxman understand it? How will an advocate understand it? It requires that you put technical people when you draft these pieces of legislation. And if they have not been done, at least have expert witnesses who can come and depose. So very few judges in the Supreme Court, not even in the High Court, have used this concept of getting an accounting expert. But I think this should, in my view, if the expert witnesses concept is brought down at a lower level, you'll avoid disputes. And then even if the disputes occur, the higher appellate forum will be able to factor in the expert witnesses before you take a decision. So there's a very popular case of GSK on transfer pricing under the Canadian law. It traveled to the Canadian Federal Court, and the debate over there was that the active pharmaceutical ingredient which is used for manufacturing a paracetamol, whether that is a generic or it is a drug arising out of R&D. And the entire judgment of the Canadian Federal Court has dealt with how the expert witnesses were questioned. So I think that for important cases where expert witnesses come, I think the decision would be far more strengthened. Alternate dispute resolution, this is just the, we've commented on what are the dispute resolution frameworks that are there today. I think we do have alternate dispute resolution frameworks. So whenever we travel overseas, our clients, attorneys from other law firms do ask us this question: does India have an alternate dispute resolution system in place? And we say, yes, do we have? And this is what is written. So Authority on Advance Ruling, DRP, APA, Settlement Commission, MAP are alternate dispute resolution processes. The question is, how do they function and the efficacy of each of those functions? So we have kind of laid down, what are the challenges that we see in the current alternate dispute resolution system that we have. For example, AAR, why are the cases piling up? Now, let me give you an example. If I have filed for an AAR ruling in 2012 and the assessments are getting time barred or would have got time barred, and I haven't even got a decision out of it, then the question I ask myself, how effective is this alternate dispute resolution system? Or if I file an AR application, and for every application, the only point and the first point that the department has to make, oh, this is a tax evasion scheme. And it takes 3 years then for me to get a matter admitted in the AR. So the whole efficacy of the AR system has got lost out. I think we've spoken a lot about the DRP challenges and recommendations. The only one recommendation I'd like to make, two recommendations. Number one, it's a collegium of 3 commissioners. 3 commissioners can judiciously debate whether an issue needs to be decided in favor of the taxpayer or partly in favor of the taxpayer, or it has to go in appeal. 2 things. One, get independent experts. Most of the matters that go before the DRP are transfer pricing related. Look at an economist who can sit as a part of the collegium of commissioners within the DRP. It will facilitate in resolution of dispute. 2, empower the DRP to adjudicate. Empower the DRP to compromise a dispute. At the end of the day, it's a private ruling. There is no binding impact. I don't think that if 3 commissioners come to a conclusion that it should not be cost plus 10% or it should not be cost plus 20% as proposed by the officer, but it should be cost plus 15%. At least the dispute gets closed. And I don't think that there is any binding impact of that. So I think we need to get over our mindset that if I compromise a dispute, I'm laying any kind of precedence. And even in MAP cases, none of the MAP outcomes apply to other taxpayers. As a matter of fact, the outcomes don't even apply to the same taxpayer for the latter years. So why can't we do it at the DRP level? At the end of the day, and it should be very clearly told the taxpayer that this has no binding impact, but we'll be able to close the dispute. APA, I think very good move. If India was early in legislating transfer pricing law, it was late in legislating the APA law. But having said that, we have it. I'm not surprised with the number of APA applicants and aspirants that we have today. Now the question is, how fast are these getting resolved? I also feel, and this is a point that I keep on making to all the APA commissioners, that the real proof of APA will come in not at the number of disposals of unilateral APA, but bilateral. Because it is only when you have a bilateral APA that you will be able to give a confidence to the taxpayer that he or she is protected not just in India, but also in the overseas jurisdiction. So I think we should lay down a target of how many APAs will be resolved, primarily the bilateral APA. Income Tax Settlement Commission, I think in my view, again, 2 points I wanted to make. One, this whole interpretation of what is true and full disclosure. Again, there is an increasing trend that once the Income Tax Settlement Commission has adjudicated and settled a dispute, government is filing an appeal into the High Court by way of writ petition. So I think there is an element of trust deficit here as well. At the end of the day, the way I look at it is the members of Income Tax Appellate Settlement Commission are really senior officials. I mean, they have served term as high as the member and the chairman of the CBDT. Now you're second guessing them by filing an appeal into the High Court. So I think this authority can be made far more effective. And I think over the years, it has really lost its sheen because of the trust deficit as well. MAP challenges and recommendations. I think a lot has been talked about, trust deficit also in the context of MAP. But I think this, in my view, is the single most important measure to build trust with your foreign administration. Whatever are the objectives that we have from an expansion of taxpayer base, deepening of taxpayer base, these are the same objectives that any tax administrations have all across the world. As a matter of fact, that the challenge that the foreign governments have today on fiscal deficits, it's far greater than the challenge India has on fiscal deficits. So you now need to put together a mechanism where there are not just established protocols, but also over a period of time, a desire that this dispute be settled. And this dispute can be settled only if we go with a mindset by saying that the taxpayer doesn't want to go through a trial. It doesn't want to go through a tedious litigation process. Now, how do we help resolve this dispute and settle this dispute? I'm not going to talk a whole lot about the ADR landscape, but I just wanted to make a specific mention of the BEPS action point 14, which talks about effective dispute resolution. India being now very, very active on the G20, on all the BEPS initiative. I think there has to be a greater degree of thinking that needs to be brought in, because the world would be now looking towards countries like India as to what kind of dispute resolution mechanism it puts in place, at least insofar as international tax disputes is concerned. I've just laid down some, more of crystal ball gazing on how do I see as the future of alternate dispute resolution. But I'm not going to be talking more about that because I've largely covered the principles. I'd rather stop over here because I'd rather focus half an hour in the panel discussion. So my request to each panel member is, you don't need to stick to the presentation that I had, but you can make your own points as to what do you think about it and your own thoughts as well. Thank you very much. First.
Sure. Few points on the statistics that Mukesh put up, and Before that, one general observation that I've seen over the years in terms of tax litigation and dealing with the tax administration is that one thing which hasn't changed is that the tax department thinks all taxpayers are dishonest, and therefore the provisions which are introduced are always introduced in that manner. One of the prime examples is the amendment on the indirect transfers. Now, it's a strange amendment, and I thought about it. What you say is that a share is deemed to be in India if its assets derive, if it derives substantially its value from assets in India. Now we have a provision 5454F. Supposing I sell off a property and I want to reinvest in another property, but that property is owned by a company. If I reinvest in a company, will the tax department give me that exemption? But it's because essentially I'm investing in that property itself. So therefore, the provisions that are introduced as a method to say that, okay, I want to tax you and that's it, that's about it. The provisions are never thought through and introduced in a manner to make the tax administration more effective or to give confidence to the taxpayers. And I think that's what, in the last 10 years that I've been in practice, that's what I've kind of grown to see. And that's what it comes out from, the trends which Mukesh put up in tax litigation. 2.32 lakh cases pending before the CIT appeal. It drastically goes down to 37,000 before the ITAT, 34,000 before the High Court, and 5,000 before the Supreme Court. And if I now look at the manpower put in, it'll be more startling. There are more than 1,000 CIT appeals in India. If you divide this figure of 232 by these 1,000 CIT appeals, it comes to about 232 matters a year. A CIT appeal can easily decide a matter a day, and all this pendency can go away. You come to the ITAT, you have 37,000 matters, you have 63 benches. 63 benches sitting throughout the year can easily dispose them off if they take 2 matters a day. Then you come to the High Court, you have 34,000 cases. You have 24 High Courts. Each High Court taking about 4 or 5 matters a day can dispose it off completely. You come to the Supreme Court, 32 judges of the Supreme Court, 1 Supreme Court, 5,000 matters. Becomes very difficult. Still the disposal is very high in terms of what is filed and actually disposed of. So therefore, there has to be a concentrated effort at the lowest level, at the CIT appeal level, to actually dispose of these matters. And one of the efforts which has been made by the tax department and the government has to be lauded is for the assessee to withdraw appeals now, if the tax amount is low, by giving a waiver of penalty or a limited penalty. I think a lot of people file appeals because they want to avoid penalty. And if that is done, I think a lot of these appeals will go. Secondly, I think Mukesh made this point that the office of the CIT appeal has become, the value has eroded over the years. And the reason is not far to see because, strangely, if the CIT appeal decides a matter in favor of the taxpayer, a similarly ranked commissioner, who's the jurisdictional commissioner, decides to appeal that decision. Now, it's a very strange concept. I think it should be left to the chief commissioner or probably a collegium of chief commissioners to decide whether to appeal an order of the CIT appeals. It should not be left to the jurisdictional commissioner. I don't think that's the proper way of dealing with the commissioner's order. Moving on, I think one of the issues which is plaguing or which is the concern of the taxpayers has been the holding up of the refunds. I've seen a lot of circulars being issued, but a lot of new novel ways I've seen in some litigation of holding up refunds. One was invoking the section 281B, provisional attachment. Now, how do you provisionally attach a refund which is a trade receivable? I don't understand that, but I've seen a few cases on that. The other is to order a special audit. Now, the refunds gets held up for years to come because 1 year special audit, then the next year special audit. So I think a lot of these things need to be ironed out. Coming to the ITAT, which I somehow slightly disagree with Mukesh on whether special benches should be very frequent. I think one of the aspects which people and which the tribunals themselves have lost sight of is that the theory of precedence does not apply to the tribunals. A tribunal can decide on the same assessee's case in a different year differently because tribunal is not a court of law. It is only interpreting facts and it applies the law to those facts. So in a given year, if they find it difficult to apply the law which they had applied in the last year, they are more than ready. We are more than welcome to disagree with that. That will encourage, I would say, disposal of cases. But what is worrisome is that if the tribunal in the subsequent year finds it difficult to dispose of the case following the last year, they tend to set it aside, which is again, you go back round and round. You don't get a solution to that. So I think that's something which the tribunal should be mindful of, that they are not the same as a court of law and can take different views in a different year. Well, of course, some of these international practices are very interesting, and probably if the government thinks they can adopt it. I had some points on the ADR framework. Mukesh made the point on the AAR, and I had this strange case where I had filed for a foreign university which wanted to run an executive MBA program in India, and the tax department in his comments said this is tax evasion. Now, how can an executive MBA program being offered through a partner in India be a mechanism of tax evasion? I fail to understand. So I think when you approach these ADR mechanisms, the effort of the tax administration should be also to resolve it and not to prolong it. Ultimately, how it went about is different. It's the AR's prerogative to decide. Dispute resolution, I agree with Mukesh that the DRP should have the power to compromise, and even in APAs, if arbitration is introduced in APAs, that will encourage a lot more people to apply for APAs. Even right now the numbers are very high. Settlement commission, well, I think it's been a major failure, to be honest. When I started my practice, one of the very senior tax practitioners and a senior advocate at the High Court said, stay away from the settlement commission, you will earn a bad name, because people who appear there, there are all hanky-panky orders. So he said, just stay away from it. And one of the points which Mr. Sanjay Kumar made in the last session was that tax evaders need to be dealt with very severely, and they need to be operated upon, in his words, and a surgery needs to be performed. I think settlement commission gives them an easy way out. You can go and settle, and the tax evaders must be hit hard. These are people who are in the so-called red zone and must not be given an alibi. A genuine taxpayer who finds that there has been a bona fide mistake has no mechanism to settle, but you have a settlement commission which allows an evader to get away. I think that should be curved at the threshold. Those about the ADR. And finally, just to conclude, I think on a policy level, the tax administration needs to wake up to the fact, and I think legislature in that way needs to wake up to the fact that a law, when it is promulgated, has to, of course, come out with clarification, but also must be a balanced provision which allows the taxpayer to come ahead and comply with it. It can't be a one-sided law. Ultimately, the tax collection which is done has to be bestowed back on the taxpayer in terms of welfare mechanisms. So if he's not comfortable, because anyways our implementation is very bad, most of the tax collected money does not go back to them. So if even the law is more, something which is non-compliant or difficult to comply, it will just give an alibi to him to not comply. The encouragement to comply should be there. And if the laws are more balanced, giving both sides an equal playing field, I think you will have more compliance going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Leela?
Thanks, Mukesh. I speaking more from a corporate side, though I have been with the tax administration, and I see the tax administration has come a long way since the time I was there to where it is now, which is a good move. There's a lot that has happened in these 20 years that I have left, and but some of the concerns that we also have a lot more big corporates now in India, MNCs operating in India, and therefore those concerns are the ones that I'm going to be focusing on. So I have a concept, my assessment done by my bosses is on something called open years. Open years is how many years do you have in litigation and how many can you close? And that is one of the key criteria. I do think the tax administration can adopt that criteria, with the officers and say, how many open years did you start with? How many are you ending with? Yeah, because that is one key criteria that I'm assessed on. And it is very difficult. Initially it was very difficult for me to tell tell people out there that in India it is very difficult to close open years, because even if I win, the tax office goes into litigation, so that year is technically still open, right? So, the years remain open for 10, 12, 15 years, and it took me a long time to sort of explain this whole concept to them, but I thought that was a very powerful tool, because it's a very black and white tool to say, are you still litigating or are you still not litigating? And you close the year. So that is one very objective way of trying to see, are we serious about reducing litigation using whatever methods we have, whatever methods we want to implement going forward. The second point, for any business, anyone operating, is they want certainty on their tax cost. Yeah, tax is one cost just like all your other costs. So you have to tell me up front, what will be my cost of operating in your country? It can be 40%, 50%, 20%, 10%. That's regardless. But I need to know up front. I cannot go in thinking it's going to be 20%, and then I'm litigating at 40% and not knowing when it's going to settle in the next 10 years. A business cannot operate in that manner, yeah? And that is where the big concern is, that what do you tell businesses? What do I tell my business? That what is your tax cost for operating any business in India today? Take any business. You can take a brick and mortar business, you take an e-commerce business, you take an ITES business. There is just no certainty as to what is the cost of operating, what is the tax cost of that particular business. And that is where I think is, that is where there needs to be focus, yeah, in terms of some out-of-the-box idea, something like, when you have transfer pricing audit cycles, what I understand is for ITES companies, you come out with a benchmark, yeah, to say this is the benchmark, and that's a benchmark that does get applied across the board. Give that benchmark to us upfront, yeah, at the end of that year. Say the cycle for 15-16 is just over. Tell me what the ITES benchmark should be. You have all the data now. You have all the comparables now. You come and tell me, if this is your FAR, this is your range. I will then accordingly put it in my transfer pricing documentation, or I know I'm in for litigation. Yeah, or I don't agree with what you've said, but I'm in for litigation. But at least I know I have some reference point when I start my work. So, these are some kind of out-of-the-box ideas, I think, that the tax administration should think of. And as Mukesh and they said, you need to engage with taxpayers, yeah? You need to engage with us. You need to understand the commercial impact of taxes, yeah, the commercial impact of taxes, be it direct tax, be it indirect tax, and we will work with you. I don't, especially as has been said, that you need to differentiate between differences in the tax position versus tax evaders, yeah. Most MNCs have a difference in a tax position, yeah. It's an interpretation issue. Should the markup be 10%, 15%? Should it be this method? Should it be that method? Is there a P? Is there not a P? Yeah, I do believe there are differences. This is not about evading taxes. Yeah, this is about genuine interpretation of law, the way you have interpreted law in other countries, the way law is getting interpreted in India. It's all about educating each other. But that cannot be, seen as tax evasion. Yeah, as small things like 271C. The moment you have an adjustment, you have that initiated, whether without even looking at the nature of the adjustment. Yeah, and as he said, this recent, initiative by the government to say if your demand is about 10 lakhs, close the matter, but you have to pay 25% penalty. Means mens rea is already been created by saying you were an evader. That's why you have to pay your penalty. These kind of, that's, when he said the law started on the assumption that you do not want to pay your taxes. I think even this whole mechanism of trying to resolve disputes is also focusing on that direction. I mean, we were genuinely looking at closing cases, but the moment we looked at penalty and, we discussed it, we said, no, but that would mean that we are accepting the fact that we did something wrong. Yeah, which is not the case. We did not do anything wrong. It was a genuine interpretation issue, but we don't want to litigate. We are willing to pay off the taxes. But the penalty is what is stopping most taxpayers, about 10 lakh MNCs, will hold back, saying, I will not accept the fact that I'm a tax evader, because I'm not a tax evader. It is not my intention not to pay the right amount of taxes, but it is not my intention also to pay every penny of tax that the tax administration wants me to pay. So that, this is the way that we should approach it more practically. We have the law, we have jurisprudence, we have our systems which need to be beefed up, which need to be strengthened. That work is happening, but at the same time, the focus on the engagement with the taxpayer is where I find a lot of gaps right now. The other part is also about, the trainings at the tax administration. Yeah, when you talk about their premier institute, the National Academy of Direct Taxes, I do think that they need professional assistance to develop curriculum at the NADT. There's a lot, that training is the basis for your tax officers. And unless there is more focus on a professional curriculum, which is equivalent to any, university that we have today teaching law, we will always have these concerns about, we'll always be facing issues about, administration versus the taxpayer. I think we are all on the same side. We are here to pay taxes for the country, for it to progress. I think that is where the mindset change is required from both sides. But, having a good grounding, a good basis is really important. And therefore, having, some professional support at the training institutes, professional support in these kind of directorates is of importance, because it cannot be that tax officers would be good at all these. So you probably need support, support to manage your HR, support to manage, these are specialized functions now. In any organization, these are, handled by very specialized people. And I think the tax administration, which is a very technical, legal, learning institute, you probably would want to look at some kind of professional support for training officers, including your in-house. I mean, there are a lot of good in-house officers, but the external support is missing. So, and in terms of, APAs and dispute resolutions, we have spoken about all that. And I think from an external point, there is the interest in the APAs, there's interest in the map, but at the same time, concerns have been raised about, India taking a much, what would I say, a very high position when it comes to markups, to say, what rest of the world is below 10%, India wants to do 10, 15, 20. So if we agree on APA in India, then we close options with all other countries. Yeah, because then you cannot look only one country, even if it's unilateral. The other countries will come to know now after BEPS, you will have to disclose all information, and BEPS, CBCR, Action 13. So these are the concerns, I think, that challenges that that the Indian administration will hear of very soon, to say, if I'm closing an APA with you, tomorrow Malaysia, Singapore, China, everybody's going to come to me with a 15% APA. Do I want to do that? Or do I really want a map? Do I want a tripartite, just to ensure that the income that I have, the 100 rupees that I have, is equally distributed? It doesn't become, the distribution doesn't become 110, though I've earned only 100. And from a perspective of a taxpayer, I think these practical issues are what needs to be, we need a solution to that. We have the mechanisms. We are working on trying to, strengthen them, as we've heard Mukesh say, as we've heard Sachin say. But, some of the thoughts that I had mostly coming out of what I just heard from Mukesh and Sachin. Thank you, Mukesh.
Thank you, Bela. Before I hand over, it's an onerous job to be able to defend everything. In this book, to be fair and balanced, and I wanted this to be more non-partisan than speaking on behalf of taxpayers, we also pointed out what are the recent initiatives that have been taken by the government, not just from a legislative viewpoint, but from a administrative viewpoint also, to address the whole issue. And as I mentioned, these things will take long term, and there is no short to medium term solution. So there are over 30 CBDT circulars that have been issued, and 23 of them deal only with the whole area of dispute resolution, which has been adequately captured. So I just didn't want to leave this session making everyone feel that I'm speaking in a one-sided manner. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Mukesh. Income tax bashing seems to have become the favorite national theme. I'm so happy to see that Mr. Arvind Modi is there. I have someone on my side. Of course, it's a very onerous task of rebutting all that has been said since morning here in various sessions. While for most of the issues, we do agree, we acknowledge that there are problems. There is no denying the fact that there are problems, and we need to really put our heads together and find solutions. But you would appreciate that department has been seized of these problems, and in the last about 5-7 years, we have covered a long distance than what we had done earlier. When the task is humongous, it's onerous, obviously the time taken would be more. Probably the expectations of the taxpayers is too big. They seem to be in a hurry. get impatient with the pace with which we are doing things. But it's not that we are not moving. We are moving every single day, and we are trying to facilitate the taxpayers as much as we can. There is a national litigation policy, as you all know, it has been in the draft. It's not that it's only the income tax department which has been a litigant. Government in all areas has been a compulsive litigant, and that's why the government at the national level realized that we have to be not a compulsive litigant, but a responsible and efficient litigant. The income tax department has also realized this, and you would see if we start cataloging that at the institutional level we have taken a number of steps to curtail litigation by increasing the thresholds, by having alternate dispute resolution systems. But the litigation which is already there, if you have a look at that also, you would, sometimes I think about it, that why there is so much of noise about litigation. I think as long as the litigation was within the house, as long as it dealt only with the domestic taxpayers, it didn't make much noise. But when it started dealing with the neighbors and with the neighbors of the neighbors, when we started dealing on the international level, when we started dealing with global companies, the noise became too much because the stakes were high. There were big players in the market, and obviously the voice of the majority, the silent majority who are catered to by the income tax department, 99% of taxpayers, they are silent. And only 1% people succeeded in making such noise that we were suddenly put on the mat all over the world. Now, while agreeing that there are problems, I request you to have a look at the different dimension of the same problem. As Mr. Bhutani said, that in other countries, right before the audit state, we are in a position to curtail the litigation. So I need to ask you the same question. Is it possible for us to contain the dispute at the very beginning? And you would see that the audits, the tax audits take place in an interactive, in a participative environment. We are the equal stakeholders in this. Now, we have no partnership can work where there are duties, only duties on one side and rights on the other side. There have to be an equal sharing of rights and duties. And we all are humans. Taxpayers are humans, the tax consultants, the taxpayers are humans, and so is the judiciary. And we all are fallible. We all suffer from imperfections. We all have to have capacity building. And when the transfer pricing regime, when the international taxation regime came in this country, we all were in the nascent stage. Probably the taxmen were more in the nascent stage because they were not so skilled. But did you, as the tax professionals, sufficiently discharge your duty to help the tax auditors frame correct assessments? Did we disclose enough? Because the information which is in the possession of the taxpayer or in the possession of the tax consultants, were all the cards put on the table? And the dispute takes place whenever you leave chinks in your presentations, whenever the information presented is not complete enough. Because I don't see, whenever you present your cases correctly and completely, I see no reason why, unless the tax officer is very, very inefficient, he may make a mistake. But if you present it before the first appellate authority and you are able to show that you did your homework well, you showed everything to the taxman, and it's the taxman's failure to comprehend those facts, to comprehend those documents, the very first appellate authority would give you 100% relief. I have done it myself. As an assessing officer, when I was in only the second year of my working in the department, I remember it was a case of a hardware firm. And when I called for the books of accounts, I found that the man had created his stock register so immaculately that even the smallest nut and bolt was mentioned in that stock register. And I still remember that I not only accepted the returned income, I at the same time recorded it in the assessment order that the stock registers and other books were so immaculately maintained that I couldn't find even a single fault with the books of accounts. And I put my appreciation on record in that assessment order. So it's not that if you do your homework completely, it actually doesn't go waste. So somewhere we fail in the discharge of our duties, and hence such high-pitched assessments take place, high-pitched TP audits take place. And you can also not say that there were not issues and we were simply litigating. There were issues. Your BEPS reports completely support this, that there was base erosion, there was profit shifting. Probably the issues we were litigating were not sufficiently matched with the existing legal framework. Probably we were there before time. Probably we were litigating without having the legal support. But well, as taxmen, probably we could see that there was aggressive tax avoidance. So it's not that we were just arguing, we were just litigating in vacuum. So it has been a combination of many, many factors actually which has led to all this kind of litigation. And when at the end of the day you think coolly about it, I'm now working in international taxation. You can count the issues on your fingers. There are not many issues. There are not many taxpayers. It is just the cobweb of litigation in which we are caught. There's multiple litigation on the same issue. First the tribunal judgment comes, Vodafone makes news. Then the High Court decision comes, Vodafone makes news. Supreme Court decision comes, Vodafone makes news. And you feel all the time the department is litigating. It's just the multiple levels of litigation on the same issue, on the same case, which is creating so much of illusion that we are litigating too much. And I also as a taxman see a problem in this. We are forced to make an addition only because the department is sitting in Supreme Court on that issue. And for that, these views are personal, for that I have been suggesting to my own people that probably we can bring a mechanism within the Income Tax Act that where an issue is stuck in the Supreme Court or in the High Court, we do not create multiple assessment. As Bela said, that issues need to be closed. You can't keep them open for 12 years, 13 years, 15 years. Probably we make only the provisional assessments on that particular issue. We don't create any demand. We do not again litigate. We just wait for the order of Supreme Court and High Court to come. And then we can give effect to that order. Probably we can expand the scope of 154, or we can bring a special provision for this in the income tax law. And I think if we could stop this multiple repeated litigation on the same subject in the same case, your number of litigation would suddenly reduce drastically. And the perception that we are litigating too much would also diminish. So we need to take a call. He talked of enhanced relationship. But enhanced relationship works only when there is a mutual trust, there is a mutual cooperation. Ethics is the underlying theme. If we are ethical players, this side and that side, if there is intellectual honesty, this side and that side, I see that litigation right at the audit stage can be curtailed to the minimum. And when, of course, there is ambiguity on law, when it's amenable to various interpretations, well, that subject must travel to the courts. That's why law is dynamic. That's how the judge-made law develops. And one should not resent that kind of litigation when one particular provision is amenable to different kind of interpretations. That would always stay. All over the world, the countries have that kind of litigation.